There are people who burn bright and then burn out, and the world nods like it expected nothing less. And then there are people like Tanya Tucker, who burned so hot, so wild, and so completely that the whole country stood back just to watch them. She was 13 years old when Nashville first heard her voice, and the people in that room knew immediately that something unusual had walked through the door. Not just talent. Not just potential. Something older than her years, something aching and certain and impossible to look away from. The kind of voice that makes you forget what you were doing before you heard it. But a voice like that, attached to a girl that young, inside an industry that hungry, was always going to lead somewhere dangerous. And it did. There were scandals that made front pages and relationships that became national conversations. There were years when the drugs took over and the music faded and the people who once lined up to sign her suddenly stopped returning calls. There were moments when the people closest to her looked at the wreckage of what fame had done and quietly wondered if she was ever coming back. For a long time, the answer seemed to be no. Nashville has a way of chewing through its brightest stars and then moving on without looking back, and for a while, it looked like Tanya Tucker was just another name on that list. People started speaking about her in the past tense while she was still very much alive, still in her 20s, still with more voice and more fire than almost anyone else in the business. They called her a cautionary tale. They called her burnt out. They used her name the way people use a warning. And she heard all of it. Here is what nobody predicted. Here is the part that will genuinely stop you. The woman they buried in conversation is now standing at the very top of the genre she helped build, holding Grammy Awards she waited 6 decades to win, inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, touring stages that younger artists would give anything to headline, and running a tequila business that is spread across more than a dozen states. At 67 years old, Tanya Tucker is not surviving. She is thriving. She is louder, sharper, and more herself than she has ever been. But to understand how she got here, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Back to a little girl in Texas who opened her mouth at 8 years old and told everyone exactly what she was going to be. Seminole, Texas, in 1958, was not the kind of place that produced international superstars. It was flat and quiet and ordinary in the way that most small towns are ordinary, the kind of place where life moves in predictable directions and the biggest excitement comes from Friday night football and Sunday morning church. Tanya Denise Tucker was born there on October 10 of that year, the youngest of 3 children, and from the very first moment she discovered music, nothing about her life was going to stay ordinary for long. Her father, Bo Tucker, was a heavy equipment operator, a working man with calloused hands and a fierce belief in his children that ran deeper than anything money could measure. He was not a man of the industry. He had no connections, no insider knowledge, and no roadmap for turning a little girl's dream into a career. What he had was the ability to see his daughter clearly, to recognize that what she carried inside her was not just a childhood hobby or a passing phase. It was a calling. And when Bo Tucker believed in something, he moved toward it without hesitation. The family moved constantly across the Southwest, following his work from one job to the next, and for most children that kind of rootless childhood would have been unsettling. For Tanya, it opened a door. For a time, they settled in Wilcox, Arizona, a small desert town with one radio station that played country music around the clock. She absorbed every note of it. Ernest Tubb and Mel Tillis, the hard-edged sound of real American music pouring through a single speaker in a house that never stayed in one place for long. While other little girls were playing with dolls, Tanya Tucker was learning the architecture of a song. At home, her older sister LaCosta was the one people called the singer in the family. LaCosta had a voice that made people stop and listen, and in most families that would have been enough to push a younger sibling into the background. Not Tanya. She watched her sister and felt not jealousy but hunger, a deep and restless need to claim something of her own. By the time she was 8 years old, she was telling anyone who would listen that she was going to be a country singer. Not that she wanted to be. Not that she hoped to be. That she was going to be. The certainty in it was something people noticed and did not forget. Her father noticed most of all. He picked up that certainty like a torch, and he never once put it down. Everything that came next began with that decision, with a father who believed his daughter before the world had any reason to. The first real break came not through music but through a camera lens, and even that felt like something the universe had arranged on purpose. At 13 years old, Tanya Tucker landed a small part in the 1972 Robert Redford film Jeremiah Johnson, Hired Along with Her Horse, which is exactly the kind of detail that tells you everything about the unconventional path she was already walking. But film was never the destination. Music was always the only destination. With a demo tape in hand and her father beside her like a shield and a battering ram at the same time, she got herself in front of Billy Sherrill, one of the most powerful producers in Nashville, a man who had shaped the careers of legends and who did not impress easily. He heard something in that demo that made him stop. He signed her to Columbia Records at 13 years old, and the machinery of fame began moving faster than anyone in her family had truly prepared for. Her debut single Delta Dawn came out in early 1972 and climbed immediately into the country top 10. Overnight, a sensation was born. The label had initially tried to keep her age quiet, worried that audiences would struggle to accept a child singing a song soaked in heartbreak and longing. The strategy failed almost immediately, and when the truth came out, when people realized that this aching, powerful, fully formed voice belonged to a girl still in 7th grade, the fascination only deepened. She was compared to Brenda Lee and Wanda Jackson, young women who had also carried voices far older than their faces suggested. But Tanya Tucker was something beyond even those comparisons. She had a rawness that felt almost unsettling, a directness that made you feel she had already lived through things she was only just beginning to understand. The hits followed quickly. What's Your Mama's Name? And Blood Red and Going Down both reached number 1 in 1973. And the machinery of her career accelerated into a speed that left no room for the ordinary rhythms of growing up. While other 13 and 14-year-olds were navigating school hallways and first friendships, Tanya Tucker was navigating record executives and concert stages and the particular cruelty of an industry that loved what she could produce without ever fully considering what producing it was costing her. Her father saw the danger even as he pushed forward. He had warned her early about what this business could do to a young girl, and he meant every word of it. But the dream was already in motion, already bigger than any single person's ability to slow it down, and the girl at the center of it was moving forward with the same certainty she had carried since she was 8 years old, standing in a small house in Arizona, listening to country music pour out of a single radio station and deciding quietly that this was exactly where she belonged. There is a moment in almost every young star's story where the industry stops treating them like a discovery and starts treating them like a product, and for Tanya Tucker that moment came brutally early. At 15 years old, she took a song called Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone to the top of the country charts. The song had been written by outlaw songwriter David Allan Coe, and its sensual, aching tone made audiences deeply uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the music itself and everything to do with who was singing it. A 15-year-old girl. Standing at a microphone. Singing about desire and devotion with a voice that sounded like it had already survived a dozen heartbreaks. Producer Billy Sherrill had been deliberately searching for hard-edged, mature material for her, pushing her further into territory that made Nashville traditionalists shift uncomfortably in their seats. Tanya did not flinch. She stood by the song with the kind of calm certainty that was becoming her signature, explaining that she heard it as something beautiful, something close to a wedding vow between two devoted people. The discomfort, she said, came from the way others chose to hear it. That response revealed something essential about who she was and who she would always be. She was not going to apologize for other people's discomfort. She was not going to soften her edges to make the industry feel better about what it had created. And the industry had absolutely created this situation, placing adult material in the hands of a child and then acting surprised when the world reacted with unease. The contradictions surrounding her teenage years were impossible to ignore. She was being handed contracts worth millions while she was still too young to sign them without a parent present. She was being linked in gossip columns to men twice her age while she was still technically a child. Even Elvis Presley, according to Tucker herself, had turned his considerable charm in her direction during those early years, flirting openly and inviting her to his Las Vegas shows before backing off once the reality of just how young she was became impossible to overlook. By 16, record companies were fighting legal battles over her contract, a bitter and expensive war that eventually landed her at MCA for a reported $1 million deal. A teenager. Negotiating 7 figures. Singing songs full of longing and heartbreak. Living entirely inside an adult world that had never once stopped to ask whether she was ready for it. Her father's early warning was not a distant concern anymore. It was already happening, already unfolding in slow motion around a girl who was fierce enough to survive it but young enough that surviving it would leave marks that would take decades to fully understand. By 1978, at just 18 years old, Tanya Tucker released an album called TNT, and it hit the country music world like a jolt of electricity through a system that was not expecting it. The cover showed her in tight red leather, a visual statement so bold and so deliberately provocative that conservative corners of Nashville reacted with something close to scandal. For the traditionalists who had built country music on images of wholesome girls and respectable women, this was a line being crossed that they were not prepared to forgive. For Tanya Tucker, it was a declaration of independence, a moment where she finally seized control of her own image from the hands of producers and label executives and managers who had been packaging her since childhood. This was her saying loudly and clearly that she was not interested in being what other people needed her to be. She was interested in being exactly who she actually was. The album went gold, which meant there was an audience hungry for this version of her, an audience that understood that what she was doing was not rebellion for rebellion's sake but authenticity finally breaking through. She herself reflected later that she did the things many people secretly wished they could do but were too afraid to try. She did not live quietly. She did not follow a path that had been carefully laid out for her by people who thought they knew what was best. She wanted to live boldly and fully, and she was willing to pay whatever price came with that choice. Not even Johnny Cash, she would say, had managed to pull headlines quite the way she did. That kind of life looked thrilling from the outside, looked like freedom and power and complete control. But freedom like that comes with a cost that is not always visible until it is too late to avoid it. In 1978, she moved to Los Angeles hoping to break further into pop music and to escape the constraints of Nashville's expectations. What she found instead was a city built on excess and a nightlife that made everything she had experienced in Tennessee look tame by comparison. She was still young, still beautiful, still carrying that voice that could stop a room. But she was also deeply alone in a way that no amount of attention or fame or adoration from strangers could touch. Night after night, she would perform, stand in front of screaming crowds, and feel all that love and energy pouring toward her from thousands of people at once. And then the music would end, the applause would fade, and she would return to an empty hotel room where none of that noise followed her. The loneliness was absolute. It was the kind of loneliness that seeps into your bones and makes you reach for anything that might fill it, anything that might make the silence less complete.